Proposition 4 is about natural resources. It's a general obligation bond placed on the ballot by the state legislature. And what it asks is, do you want the state to issue a bond for $10 billion to be spent on drought mitigation, parks, and climate mitigation? Bond financing is a type of long-term borrowing used to raise money for all types of major public infrastructure projects. Over the last 20 years, the most common purposes of bond measures were for water infrastructure and for housing. The state sells bonds to investors and then repays these investors with interest over several years. So instead of paying for the project all at once, the cost is spread over the current as well as future taxpayers, all who will benefit from the investment over many years. All general obligation bond repayment comes from the general fund. The general fund budget is currently $210 billion. Half of that money comes from income taxes from individuals, and the other half comes from sales tax and corporate taxes. $80 billion of that budget is for K through 12 schools, $70 billion for health and human services, and the remaining $60 billion is split between public colleges, jails, and other things. As of January 2024, California had $71 billion of outstanding general fund debt, $71 billion of outstanding general bond debt, and an additional $24 billion of authorized bonds that just had not been sold yet. California's overall bond debt has decreased by almost 50% since the mid-2000s when several large bonds were authorized. Yearly bond payments have been decreasing slightly over the past 10 years. During the 2022-23 fiscal year, bond payments were about 2.5% of the general fund, which is the lowest bond payment percentage has been in 20 years. Yet over the next 2 years, it's projected that California could face a $56 billion deficit. 2/3 approval in both houses of the legislature is required to place a bond on the ballot, and a 50% approval of voters is required for the bond to pass. Over the last 30 years, California voters have approved several bonds related to parks and the environment, totaling close to $9.7 billion. Over the past decade, the state has spent an average of $13 billion a year on natural resources and climate activities. About 15% of this amount has been from bonds. So if Prop 4 receives 50% voter approval, the sale of $10 billion in general obligation bonds would be authorized for expenditure on the natural environment, with $3.8 billion going to increase the amount and quality of water and to reduce flooding. $1.5 billion would go to wildfire protection and forest management. $1.2 billion would go to sea level rise mitigation and fish protection, $1.2 billion to land conservation and habitat restoration, $850 million to renewable resources like offshore wind, $700 million to state parks, $450 million to reduce risk of extreme heat, and $300 million to climate change mitigation for farms, things like reducing water, improving soil health, and reducing air pollution. Some of the funds would go towards loans and grants to local governments, to Native American tribes, and to nonprofit organizations and businesses. The Legislative Analyst's Office, which is a nonpartisan state department, projects an increased costs of about $400 million a year for 40 years to repay this bond. Payoff would be 10% more than if the state paid upfront out of the general fund now. They also project a potential reduction of state and local government costs in the tens of millions of dollars annually over the next few decades in response and recovery from damage of natural disasters by doing things like mitigating flooding and wildfires. These are not the opinion of the League of Women Voters, but people who support Prop 4 say that threats posed by wildfires, water pollution, and extreme heat are too urgent to not act now. And again, while not the opinions of the League, people who oppose Prop 4 say that bonds are the most expensive way to pay for these projects, and California should find other ways to pay for such projects without taking on more debt. As of August 24th, contributions for Prop 4 were $394,000. Top contributors were the Save the Redwoods League, who contributed $250,000, and California Association of Conservation Corps, who contributed $50,000. Also $45,000 from Save Mount Diablo and $25,000 from California State Parks Association. As of August 24th, there were no contributions against Prop 4. But finance of campaigns can change dramatically up until Election Day. Updates to campaign contributions can be seen on cal-matters.org, ballotpedia.org, cal-access.sos.ca.gov, and lao.ca.gov. The more money contributed to a campaign, the more ads you'll hear and see, whether for or against the issue. And the least reliable information you can base your vote on is any paid advertising. The media in general requires some effort to determine what's opinion and what's fact. The most reliable sources for facts are the Cal Matters, Ballotpedia, Cal Access, and LAO websites. So what your vote means, a yes on Prop 4 means you want to authorize a bond for $10 billion to fund the natural resource projects I mentioned, and a no on Prop 4 means you don't want to authorize this bond.